My sister threw the deed onto the table like unwanted garbage. She thought she had stripped away our money, reputation, and future, leaving me a rotting house in a forgotten harbor. She never understood that some ruins secretly hold a family's entire soul. 5 years later, amidst camera flashes, hungry investors, and seven-figure valuations flooding that exact doorstep, she came back. She smiled at me as if she had never betrayed me. My name is Aaliyah Newman. I am 29 years old. The scent of damp earth and funeral lilies was still clinging to the heavy wool of my black coat when the robbery began. We had not even been away from the cemetery for 2 hours. The funeral guests were likely still gathered at the reception hall across town, sipping lukewarm coffee and offering hollow condolences to the empty air. I should have been there, mourning the sudden loss of my parents in a highway collision just 5 days prior. Instead, my older sister, Sloane Newman, had intercepted me at the cemetery gates. Her command had been brief, delivered with the sterile efficiency of a corporate mandate. She told me to come straight to the family home to settle the paperwork today. The air inside our childhood home felt entirely wrong. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a space that had instantly transformed from a sanctuary into a boardroom. Sloane sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table. This was the same table where we had shared Thanksgiving dinners for 2 decades, where my father had carved the turkey and my mother had poured the wine. Now, the table was stripped of its familiar lace runner, serving only as a cold, hard surface for towering stacks of legal folders, ledger books, and polished leather portfolios. Sloane did not look like a woman who had just watched her mother and father be lowered into the ground. Her black designer dress was immaculate, free of a single wrinkle or stray piece of lint. Her posture was rigid. Her face was set in the calculating mask of a woman who had already won a high-stakes game I did not even realize we were playing. Beside her sat a gaunt man in a slate-gray suit, his hands resting neatly on a briefcase. "Sit down, Aaliyah," Sloane instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite her. She did not offer me water. She did not ask how I was holding up. The man in the suit introduced himself as Arthur Vance, a senior partner specializing in estate law and asset management. He did not offer condolences either. He simply opened his briefcase, retrieved a thick binder, and began to read. For the next 45 minutes, I sat in suffocating silence as Vance meticulously dismantled my family, my history, and my future. He spoke in a monotone drone, weaponizing legal jargon to execute the theft. He detailed a complex web of irrevocable trusts, newly formed holding companies, and sudden portfolio transfers that had supposedly been set in motion over the last 18 months. I listened, my heart pounding against my ribs, as the entirety of my parents' wealth was systematically funneled in one direction: the massive suburban estate we were currently sitting in, the robust retirement accounts containing hundreds of thousands of dollars, the diverse stock portfolios, the liquid cash and high-yield savings accounts. 100% of the valuable, tangible assets were placed under the sole control of Sloane Newman. This structure is highly irregular, but I assure you it is completely legal, Vance stated, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The late Mr. and Mrs. Newman granted your sister full power of attorney late last year, allowing these transfers to solidify the estate against probate taxes. Your sister is now the primary beneficiary and sole trustee. I sat there paralyzed. The air left my lungs. My parents had never mentioned any of this. They had always spoken of fairness, of splitting things equally down the middle between their 2 daughters. This was a surgical extraction of wealth, orchestrated behind closed doors, leaving me with nothing but the crushing weight of sudden betrayal. "What about me?" I asked. My voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the cavernous dining room. Sloane smiled. It was a chilling, microscopic lifting of the corners of her mouth. It was a smile completely devoid of empathy, grief, or sisterly affection. She reached into the stack of documents and slid a single, shockingly thin manila folder across the polished mahogany wood. It came to a stop right in front of my hands. Mother and father did not forget you. Aaliyah, Sloane said smoothly. You get the property in Maryland. My hands shook slightly as I opened the folder. Inside lay a single deed. It was for a brick row house located in the Docklight district of Ashby Harbor. I stared at the address, my mind struggling to process the information. I only knew of the Docklight district from grim local news reports. It was a severely declining port neighborhood, a graveyard of forgotten blue-collar industries. It was an area plagued by boarded-up windows, chain-link fences, condemned signs, and rampant urban decay. Vance cleared his throat again, leaning forward as if to twist the knife Sloane had just plunged into my chest. I must formally advise you, Ms. Newman, that this specific property is currently heavily encumbered. There are over $14,000 in unpaid municipal utility liens attached to the address. Furthermore, the city has issued multiple structural citations over the past 3 years. The roof requires immediate and total replacement. The electrical wiring is non-compliant with modern codes, and there are severe plumbing violations. It is a significant financial liability. You will be entirely responsible for all associated repair costs and back taxes. He was making sure I fully grasped the cruelty of the arrangement. They were not giving me a home or a piece of an inheritance. They were handing me an anchor, tossing it into the ocean, and expecting me to drown quietly. I looked up at Sloane. You took everything, the cash, the house, the investments, and you left me with a condemned building in a dead neighborhood. Sloane leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with an air of absolute superiority. I am simply executing the legal reality of the estate. Aaliyah, you always were the unpredictable one, drifting from one minor job to another. I have the business acumen to manage the capital responsibly. This property is your portion. It is your project now. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the yellowed paper resting in front of me. Her eyes locked onto mine, gleaming with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. Take this shabby house. I do not need it anyway, she said. Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. I felt a violent surge of anger rising in my throat, begging to be let out in a scream. I wanted to tear the deed into 100 pieces and throw it in her face. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table, but the brutal, cold reality of my situation slammed into me, forcing me to swallow my rage. My current apartment lease in the city was set to expire in exactly 21 days. I had planned to ask my parents for a small loan to cover the deposit on a new, more affordable place. Now, they were gone. I had less than $2,000 in my checking account. I could not afford a lawyer to fight this complex web of trusts Sloane had woven. I had no safety net, no backup plan, and absolutely nowhere else to go. I was cornered on the most agonizing day of my life. I had no choice but to take the burden. Without breaking eye contact with my sister, I reached out and pulled the manila folder toward my chest. I closed it slowly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I stood up from the table. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, breaking the sterile silence of the room. I turned my back on Sloane, on the lawyer, and on the home that no longer belonged to me. I walked out the front door and down the driveway toward my rusted sedan, the bitter winter wind biting at my face. It was only when I sat inside the freezing car, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands, that I opened the folder one more time. I slid the thick, stiff paper of the deed out to examine the signatures. As I did, my fingers brushed against something hard taped to the back of the heavy parchment. I flipped the document over. There, secured by a single, perfectly cut square of faded beige masking tape, was a small, heavy brass key. There was no attached note. There were no instructions, no return address, and no explanation. But I recognized the meticulous, perfectly straight way the tape had been applied. It was my mother's doing. She had always taped her household labels with that exact precision. I carefully peeled the tape back and held the cold brass key in the palm of my hand. The metal was worn, its teeth smoothed down by years of use. I stared at it as my breathing finally began to steady. The suffocating despair that had gripped me in that dining room slowly shifted into something entirely different. Sloane thought she had handed me a pile of worthless bricks just to watch me fail. But my mother had hidden this key beneath the legal jargon and the debt. It was a tiny, silent message left behind just for me. There was a secret buried inside those crumbling walls in Ashby Harbor. There was something in that forgotten, decaying row house that my sister, in all her arrogant greed, had never even bothered to look for. The drive into Ashby Harbor took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes, but crossing the boundary into the Docklight district felt like dropping into another century. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting a sickly yellow glow over cracked asphalt, chain-link fences, and abandoned industrial shells. I pulled my rusted sedan up to the curb, cutting the engine in front of the address that was now my entire world. The row house was a grim silhouette of dull, soot-stained red brick. Most of the first-floor windows were sealed shut with heavy plywood boards. The concrete front steps were severely fractured, split right down the middle by a thick, aggressive weed that had forced its way through the stone. But what truly commanded attention was the front door. It was practically papered over with neon-colored municipal notices, final warnings, and structural citation letters flapping violently in the harsh wind coming off the harbor. I pushed through the warnings, shoving my shoulder against the heavy wood until the swollen door finally gave way. The smell hit me the second I stepped inside. It was a thick, suffocating wave of damp earth, stale air, and rotting timber. I flicked the light switch by the entrance. Nothing happened. The electricity had clearly been shut off for a long time. Pulling out my phone, I turned on the flashlight and swept the narrow beam across the impenetrable darkness. Huge chunks of plaster had detached from the ceiling, littering the hardwood floor with chalky debris. A slow, rhythmic dripping echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. Exposed, ancient cloth-wrapped electrical wires dangled dangerously from the cracked molding. I walked slowly toward the back. The kitchen looked like an archaeological dig, coated in a layer of dust so thick and undisturbed that it was obvious no one had lived a proper life here for at least 2 decades. But as I stepped back into the cavernous main room of the ground floor, the beam of my light caught something unexpected. This was not a standard living room. Taking up nearly the entire left half of the space was a massive, heavy-duty wooden workbench. Resting on its scarred surface were hand planes, chisels, and heavy iron clamps, all heavily oxidized and fused with rust. Along the far wall, large industrial shelving units stood shrouded beneath heavy gray tarps. I pulled one of the dusty canvases back, coughing as a cloud of debris filled the air. Beneath it sat stacks of raw, aged lumber and the unmistakable remnants of a vanished trade. This had not just been a home. It had been an artisan workshop. "Are you actually going inside, or just conducting a flashlight tour?" a voice rasped from the open doorway. I spun around, nearly dropping my phone. Standing on the cracked front step was a black woman in her early 60s, wrapped tightly in a thick quilted coat. Her sharp, calculating eyes assessed me with the kind of practiced scrutiny that made me instantly aware of how out of place I looked at. "I own it," I said, my voice defensive and tight. She snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "Congratulations. You own the biggest fire hazard on the block. I am Inez Bell. I live 2 doors down. Retired city building inspector, which means I know exactly how many codes this death trap is currently violating." Inez stepped over the threshold, unfazed by the gloom. "I sent 3 certified letters to a Sloane Newman over the last 2 years. The roof is sagging, and the runoff is flooding my foundation. She never answered a single one. She just ignored the city fines until they piled up to the roof." "Sloane is my sister," I replied, the bitterness sharp on my tongue. "She just handed the deed over to me today." Inez raised an eyebrow, looking from me to the water stains on the ceiling. "Well, sister or not, she handed you a sinking ship. You better learn how to swim." She turned and walked back out into the cold night, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating dark. I spent the next 2 hours dragging my meager belongings from the car into the dusty kitchen, the only room with a lockable secondary door. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the funeral, the betrayal, and the sheer hostility of this new reality. I rolled out a cheap sleeping bag on the peeling linoleum floor, trying to ignore the biting cold. Sometime past midnight, a sharp, violent crack shattered the silence. It was not a creak of old wood, it was the sound of metal giving way under pressure. Seconds later, the heavy, rushing sound of water echoed from the front room. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my phone. The beam illuminated a nightmare. One of the exposed, rusted pipes running along the baseboard near the workbench had completely ruptured. A thick, muddy torrent of freezing water was violently spraying across the room, rapidly pooling over the original hardwood floors and creeping toward the antique tools. Panic flared in my chest. My first instinct was to grab my bags and run back to my car, but a harder, colder realization pinned me to the floor. I had nowhere else to go. This decaying, crumbling shell was my absolute last stand. If the floor rotted out tonight, I would be sleeping on the streets tomorrow. I dropped to my knees, the freezing water soaking instantly through my jeans. I swept my hands frantically along the wall, feeling blindly for the main shutoff valve. The water pressure was blinding. My fingertips brushed over the coarse brick, stinging slightly, until I finally found a solid iron wheel tucked awkwardly behind a wooden pillar. I clasped it with both hands and turned it clockwise. It was locked tight, with decades of rust. I screamed in frustration, using every ounce of my body weight to force it. With a horrifying screech of metal, the valve turned. I spun it until it locked tight. The violent spray sputtered, choked, and finally died into a pathetic trickle. I collapsed backward into the freezing puddle, gasping for air, my chest heaving in the dark. I had to get the water off the wood immediately. I grabbed an old, stiff tarp from the shelving unit and began desperately pushing the flood out the front door. The wall behind the burst pipe was soaked through. To prevent the moisture from trapping and rotting the studs, I grabbed a rusty putty knife from the workbench and began violently scraping away the soggy, peeling layers of floral wallpaper. As the thick paper tore away in wet clumps, my flashlight caught a strange pattern underneath. I stopped scraping, wiping the grime away with my sleeve. I leaned closer. Beneath the ruined wallpaper, the original plaster was covered in meticulous, hand-drawn graphite lines. They were complex measurement grids, precise angles, and detailed artisan symbols sketching out joints and joinery. These were not the random scribbles of a hobbyist. This was the deliberate, mathematical language of a master craftsman treating these walls as a giant, functional drafting board. This house had not just been lived in. It had been a place of serious, focused creation. My wet clothes were clinging to me, but I suddenly felt a surge of pure adrenaline. I stood up and walked toward the main staircase. My mother had taped that brass key to the deed for a reason. I knelt by the heavy oak stairs, running my hands along the wooden paneling underneath. I pressed against the trim, feeling for a gap, a seam, anything. On the third panel from the bottom, the wood shifted slightly under my palm. I pushed harder. The panel popped outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a small, dark compartment built directly into the framework of the stairs. Inside the hollow space sat a heavy metal lockbox. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It fit the mechanism perfectly and turned with a satisfying click. I flipped the lid open. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound ledger with its edges heavily singed by fire, and a long, sealed cylindrical drafting tube. I sat cross-legged on the damp floorboards, surrounded by puddles of water, peeling wallpaper, and the scent of decay. I pulled the rolled parchment from the tube and spread it out across my lap. It was a series of flawless, intricate furniture blueprints, marked with a distinctive maker's seal. I opened the singed ledger. It was filled with lists of high-end clients, material costs from decades ago, and profit margins that made my eyes widen. The silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer empty. It felt expectant. I looked around the ruined workshop, gripping the blueprints in my dirty, scraped hands. For the very first time since the lawyer pushed that folder across the table, a sharp, dangerous clarity cut through my grief. My sister had discarded this property because she saw nothing but rot, debt, and ruin. She had thrown it away to punish me, but as I sat in the dirt, surrounded by a legacy hidden in the walls, I realized the ultimate truth. Sloane did not just despise this house. She had absolutely no idea what she had just thrown away. My days were split into two completely different realities. From 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, I sat under the sterile fluorescent lights of Harbor Crown Risk. My job as a commercial compliance analyst involved staring at spreadsheets, assessing corporate liability, and flagging high-risk assets for companies that traded millions of dollars before lunch. It was a world of crisp suits, forced smiles, and calculated detachment. But the moment the clock struck 6, I traded my corporate blazer for a heavy canvas jacket, drove back into the shadows of the harbor, and stepped into the past. My nights were consumed by the ledger and the drafting tube. I spent hours scrubbing decades of grime from the wooden floors, carefully preserving every graphite measurement drawn on the plaster. I categorized the charred receipts and studied the intricate joinery detailed on the heavy parchment. On my 4th evening there, a heavy knock rattled the front door. I pulled it open to find my neighbor, Inez, standing beside a tall, broad-shouldered man with rough, calloused hands and a thick gray beard. "This is Emmett Vale," Inez announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He was a union carpenter for 40 years. He lives 2 streets over. "I told him you were staring at old wood and drawing lines, so I figured you needed someone who actually knows what they are looking at." Emmett did not say much at first. He walked straight to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the massive workbench, the rusted tools, and finally resting on the blueprints I had pinned across a makeshift table. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his flannel shirt pocket and leaned over the drafting paper. For 3 full minutes, the only sound was the wind howling against the boarded windows. "Where did you get these?" Emmett finally asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "They were hidden," I replied carefully. "They belonged to my grandfather." Emmett traced a thick finger over the stylized seal stamped in the bottom right corner of the drawing. It was a crest I had barely noticed before, a subtle interlocking of 2 letters. "Your grandfather was not a Newman," Emmett said, looking up at me. "This seal belongs to the Bellamy line. They made some of the finest custom cabinetry on the East Coast back in the 70s and 80s. People used to wait 18 months just to get a dining chair built by them. If these are original Bellamy schematics, you're sitting on a ghost town of design history." The name Bellamy hit me like a physical blow. My parents had never spoken that name. They had always presented our family history as a straight, unbroken line of Newmans, built on modern finance and suburban respectability. They had actively erased the man who drew these lines. The next morning, I used my lunch break to visit the city municipal archives. Sitting at a microfilm reader, I fed reels of property deeds and old business registries through the machine. It took me 2 solid hours to find the connection. My grandfather, Arthur Bellamy, had indeed owned the row house. When he died, the property passed to my mother, who quietly transferred it into my father's surname, Newman, effectively burying the artisan legacy under a layer of corporate legalities. But the archival records revealed something far more valuable than a hidden name. I pulled the original zoning survey from 1974. I traced the boundaries of the lot with my finger. The property lines did not end at the back wall of the row house, as I had assumed. They extended back another 40 feet, encompassing a rear service alleyway and a separate, detached brick carriage house. For years, the neighborhood had simply assumed that the overgrown structure in the back belonged to the city's abandoned utility grid. According to this faded piece of paper, I owned it. Even more shocking was the zoning classification stamped in faded red ink across the top of the permit. The building was not just zoned for residential use. It carried a rare, heavily protected commercial designation known as a live work artisan classification. in a district where the city was ruthlessly shutting down unpermitted businesses and rezoning the waterfront. I held a golden ticket. I had the legal right to manufacture and sell goods directly from the ground floor. I returned to the row house that evening with a singular focus. I needed to test the weight of the Bellamy name. Using a small portion of my dwindling savings, I purchased a set of basic restoration tools, wood glue, and several planks of reclaimed walnut. I chose the simplest design from the blueprints, a mid-century style apothecary cabinet with angular legs and seamless dovetail joints. I worked every night for 2 weeks. Emmett came by twice to show me how to properly sharpen a chisel and how to clamp the wood without bruising the grain. My hands blistered and my back ached from sleeping on the linoleum, but the physical labor was a welcome distraction from the lingering grief of the funeral. When the cabinet was finally finished, I rubbed it down with a dark, rich oil finish. It was completely flawless. It looked like it had been pulled directly from a high-end vintage catalog. I took several photographs of the piece, making sure to capture the sharp angles and the rich texture of the walnut, and posted them on an elite online marketplace for architectural salvage and custom furniture. I did not attach my name. I simply listed it as an original build based on newly discovered Bellamy schematics. I expected silence. I hoped for maybe a few $100s to cover my groceries for the month. Less than 12 hours later, my inbox pinged with a notification. A prominent interior designer based in New York had sent a direct message. She did not ask for a discount. She did not ask for more photos. She simply offered me $3,500, asking if I could arrange freight shipping by the end of the week. I sat on my sleeping bag, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. $3,500 for one small cabinet. I looked around the dusty, dilapidated room. I saw the rusted handplanes, the heavy iron wheels, and the graphite lines waiting to be brought back to life. I realized exactly what my family had done. My parents, and later my sister, had been so obsessed with easy liquid wealth, with stock portfolios and immediate cash, that they had buried a tangible, irreplaceable legacy. They had chosen the illusion of high society over the dignity of creation. I stood at a crossroads. I could take this initial burst of money, sell the house to a bottom-feeding developer for a fraction of its true worth, and walk away to find a normal, quiet life. I could take the easy way out and let Sloan win the narrative, or I could stay. I walked over to the heavy workbench and ran my hand along the scarred, uneven wood. The cold draft from the boarded windows no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a challenge. I was not going to sell this house. I was going to strip away the rot, rebuild the foundation, and turn this forgotten shell into the exact thing my sister thought she had destroyed. I was going to build a career, a life, and an empire on the very ground she had discarded. The transition from a graveyard of broken wood to a functioning business did not happen overnight. It was built on calloused hands, splintered fingernails, and the lingering scent of sawdust mixed with sweat. I officially named the ground floor Docklight Atelier. It was no longer just a room. It was a dual-purpose survival engine, serving as both a rigorous wood restoration workshop and a bespoke design space. I dragged the heavy canvas tarps out to the dumpster, sanded the brutal rust off the iron clamps, and organized my grandfather's salvaged handplanes into a militant row across the workbench. My first real commission did not come from an elite Manhattan buyer. It walked right through my front door on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Tessa Ward was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who had recently purchased a narrow storefront 2 blocks away to open an independent coffee roastery. She had heard the buzzing of my orbital sander from the sidewalk. Tessa needed a massive front service counter and a series of floating display shelves. She did not want sleek, modern particle board. She wanted the bruised, authentic soul of the old harbor. We agreed on a price of $4,500, with 50% paid up front to cover the raw materials. I had the vision, but I still lacked the seasoned muscle memory. That was where Emmett became indispensable. The retired carpenter started showing up every afternoon with a thermos of black coffee, stepping naturally into the role of a harsh but brilliant mentor. He taught me how to read the tight, wavy grain of old-growth white oak. He showed me how to apply steam and localized pressure to flatten out severely warped floorboards without snapping them in half. Stop treating it like it is dead. Emmett scolded me one evening as I aggressively sanded a reclaimed banister. He placed his massive, rough hand over mine, stopping the machine. There is a massive difference between old junk and a piece of history. Junk is just trash waiting for a landfill. History has tension. It has scars from the people who touched it before you. Your job is not to erase the damage. Your job is to smooth the edges so the damage tells a story. I took his words to heart when I tackled the central staircase of the row house. The heavy mahogany handrail had been painted over with 3 thick, hideous layers of lead-based white gloss. I spent 48 grueling hours applying chemical strippers, meticulously peeling back the toxic layers until the original, deep red mahogany grain was exposed. I polished it with a custom blend of beeswax and orange oil until it glowed like dark amber. Tessa was so impressed with the progress on her cafe counter that she brought a friend by the workshop. Her friend happened to run a highly followed local architectural blog focusing on urban revitalization. He filmed a short, raw video of my hands working the restored mahogany staircase, contrasting the gleaming wood against the exposed brick of the ruined hallway. He posted the video on a Thursday. By Sunday morning, it had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. My email inbox, previously a barren wasteland, suddenly contained 32 serious inquiries for custom furniture and historical restoration consultations. Money was finally beginning to materialize. The crushing weight of my immediate poverty was lifting. I felt a dangerous flicker of hope. Then, the city delivered its knockout punch. I returned from the lumberyard to find a bright orange sticker slapped across the center of my front door. It was an immediate cease and desist order from the Municipal Code Enforcement Division. The notice stated unequivocally that the entire electrical grid and fire suppression system of the commercial ground floor were critically non-compliant. I had exactly 10 days to secure permits and complete a total system overhaul, or the property would be padlocked and condemned by the state. I sat on the front steps, the orange paper trembling in my hands. I called 3 local commercial electricians. The lowest estimate I received was $12,000. I had exactly $4,000 in my newly opened business account, and most of that belonged to Tessa for her materials. I was staring down the barrel of a brutal, unforgiving choice. I could liquidate my small savings, abandon the cafe project, and let the city board up the house. I could walk away, find a miserable desk job, and admit that Sloane had been absolutely right about me failing. Her cold voice echoed in my mind, telling me to take this shabby house because she did not need it anyway. The anger flared. Hot and bright, I refused to let her win. I marched down to a local credit union the next morning and laid out my grandfather's ledger, the viral video statistics, and Tessa's signed contract. I fought for 2 hours until a sympathetic loan officer finally approved a high-interest microloan for $9,000. It was a terrifying financial risk, but I signed the papers without hesitation. For the next 9 days, my life became a blur of copper wire and plaster dust. I hired a licensed electrical crew who agreed to work the night shift. To keep my business running and fulfill my promise to Tessa, I worked alongside them, feeding wires through the walls while they installed the heavy-duty breaker panels and commercial fire sprinklers. I did not sleep in a bed. I curled up on the wooden workbench for 2 or 3 hours at a time, using a rolled-up canvas jacket as a pillow. My body ached constantly. My hands were covered in fresh cuts, and my eyes were permanently bloodshot. On the afternoon of the 9th day, the city inspector walked through the door. He spent an hour poking flashlights into the ceilings and testing the new junction boxes. Finally, he scribbled his signature across a green form and handed it to me. The orange sticker was removed. The atelier was officially and legally mine. That night, the house was entirely quiet. The electricians were gone. I was physically broken, but mentally vibrating with victory. I decided to finish one last task before finally collapsing into my sleeping bag. The rear wall of the workshop, where the old plumbing had burst, still needed structural reinforcement. I grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and carefully knocked out a row of loose, water-damaged bricks near the floorboards to insert a new wooden support beam. As the third brick crumbled inward, my hammer struck something hollow and metallic. I dropped the sledgehammer and reached into the dark, dusty cavity. My fingers closed around a heavy, tarnished brass cylinder. It was completely sealed at both ends with thick wax. I carried it over to the workbench, grabbing a chisel to break the hardened seal. The cap popped off with a puff of stale, dry air. Inside was a thick roll of stiff, waxed, architectural paper. I spread it out under the harsh glare of my single work lamp. It was not another furniture design. It was an original, notarized municipal boundary map dated nearly 50 years ago. I traced the thick black ink lines with my dirt-stained finger. The survey I had seen at the library was just a copy, a suggestion of ownership. But this document was the definitive, legally binding deed of partition. It contained the official surveyor seals and the exact geographic coordinates. It proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the massive brick carriage house sitting at the back of the alley was completely unencumbered and firmly attached to my parcel of land. I stared at the heavy brass cylinder and the undeniable proof of ownership. The city did not own that structure. I did. The carriage house was easily 3 times the square footage of my ground floor workshop. With the waterfront gentrification creeping closer every day, I was not just sitting on a historic artisan space anymore. I had just uncovered a piece of prime, highly coveted commercial real estate. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face. The game had just completely changed. The air in the Docklight district began to shift long before the construction cranes actually arrived. It started with a quiet, systematic erasure of the neighborhood's long-term residents. Anonymous holding companies began buying up the crumbling properties on either side of my row house. You could smell the speculative money rolling in over the damp harbor breeze. The area was rapidly transforming into a high-stakes chessboard, and a massive real estate acquisition firm named Calder Stone Assemblies was aggressively playing as white, making the opening moves before anyone else even realized the game had begun. They did not send a wrecking ball first. They sent a man in a bespoke Navy suit named Julian. Julian walked into the newly lit ground floor of the atelier on a Tuesday morning, carefully sidestepping a pile of fragrant cedar shavings. He carried a leather portfolio and wore the practiced, sympathetic smile of a predator trying to look like a savior. He looked around the workshop, his eyes gliding over my tools and the restored wood, as if they were quaint little hobbies rather than a functioning business. "It is a tremendous amount of work for a young woman to take on all alone," Julian said, his voice dripping with forced concern. Calder Stone Assemblies specializes in neighborhood revitalization. We understand the sheer financial weight of these historic liabilities. We are prepared to offer you a highly generous exit strategy. He opened his portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across my workbench. It was an initial buyout offer for $120,000. It was an insultingly low figure. It barely covered the raw land value of the front lot, completely ignoring the commercial zoning, the newly discovered carriage house, and the operational business I had bled to build. Julian was banking on the assumption that I was a naive, exhausted amateur who would jump at the first sight of a 6-figure check to escape the crushing reality of urban decay. "I appreciate your concern for my workload, Julian," I said, not even bothering to pick up the paper. "But my property is not a liability. It is the anchor of this block. And it is absolutely not for sale." Julian's smile tightened, the friendly veneer cracking just a fraction of an inch. "I strongly urge you to reconsider. The neighborhood is changing rapidly. Holdouts often find themselves completely isolated. The fines, the taxes, the pressure, it can become quite unbearable." "I am very familiar with pressure," I replied coldly, pointing my chisel toward the heavy oak door. "Have a safe drive back to the financial district." the moment his luxury sedan disappeared around the corner. I picked up my phone. I knew exactly what his thinly veiled threat meant. Calderstone assemblies would try to squeeze me out using municipal loopholes, zoning complaints, and endless legal harassment. If I was going to hold my ground, I needed a shield. I found that shield in Naomi Voss. Naomi was a razor-sharp attorney who operated out of a sleek office downtown, specializing exclusively in title, zoning, and historic preservation law. She did not waste time with pleasantries. When I laid out the original Bellamy blueprints, the new carriage house deed, and Julian's lowball offer on her glass desk, her eyes lit up with predatory intellect. I hired her on retainer using the profits from Tessa's cafe project and 3 subsequent online furniture sales. Her first task was to conduct a forensic audit of the property's entire legal history, tracing the title all the way back through my parents' estate. 2 weeks later, Naomi called me back into her office. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. She had a thick stack of financial disclosures spread out in front of her. "Your sister and her attorney played a very dangerous game during probate," Naomi stated, her tone dangerously calm. When I pulled the historical insurance and trust records attached to the docklight address, I found a massive discrepancy. She tapped a manicured fingernail against a highlighted bank ledger. "When your grandfather passed, he established a specific, ring-fenced maintenance trust designed solely for the structural upkeep of the artisan property. Furthermore, there was a substantial commercial insurance payout related to a minor fire in the carriage house over 15 years ago. Those funds never lapsed. At the time of your parents' death, there was roughly $140,000 legally bound to the specific maintenance of your row house." My blood ran ice cold. I stared at the numbers on the page, feeling a physical sickness twisting in my stomach. "Are you telling me that money existed on the day of the funeral?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It existed," Naomi confirmed, leaning forward, "but it was never presented during the inheritance division. Arthur Vance used a highly questionable loophole to reclassify those specific preservation funds as general liquid assets just weeks before your parents died. Sloan absorbed every single penny of the cash meant to repair your roof and fix your plumbing. And then she handed you the rotting building, fully aware that it was starving for the capital she had just pocketed. They had not just given me a heavy burden, they had actively stolen the life support system attached to it. I stood up, pacing the length of Naomi's office. A violent, white-hot fury threatened to consume my rational thought. I wanted to call Sloan. I wanted to drag her into a courtroom immediately and expose her as a thief. "We file a civil suit right now," I demanded, turning back to the desk. "No," Naomi countered sharply, holding up her hand. "We do absolutely nothing of the sort. Not yet. If you strike now, Sloan has the corporate capital to bury you in endless litigation. You are still vulnerable. If you want to destroy her narrative and protect this asset from Calderstone, you need to be financially bulletproof, and your operational record must be utterly spotless. We keep this evidence locked away. You focus on making that building undeniable." I swallowed my rage. Naomi was right. A premature attack would be suicide. I channeled every ounce of my anger back into the wood and the brick. Over the next 4 months, I used the steady stream of income from my growing list of high-end design clients to completely transform the public face of the building. I hired a specialized crew to chemically peel the decades of soot from the exterior, revealing the stunning, vibrant red brick underneath. I ripped down the plywood and installed massive, heavy-pane industrial windows framed in matte black steel. Above the entrance, I mounted a hand-carved, gold-leafed sign reading Docklight Atelier. The building that had once been the laughingstock of the district was now stopping traffic. Luxury SUVs began parking on the cracked asphalt as wealthy clients from the suburbs came to view my showroom. I was no longer a desperate girl surviving in a ruin. I was a legitimate fixture of the city's design ecosystem. The sheer visibility of my success finally forced the city's hand. On a crisp Thursday morning, I received a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the municipal crest. It was a highly restricted invitation to a closed-door urban planning session at City Hall. Naomi accompanied me, her briefcase loaded with our airtight zoning documents. We were escorted into a large, wood-paneled conference room filled with city council members, zoning commissioners, and the senior partners of Calder Stone Assemblies. Julian was there, his arrogant smile faltering the moment I walked through the heavy double doors in a tailored suit, looking nothing like the exhausted girl he had tried to bully months ago. The head of the Planning Commission unveiled a massive, illuminated topographical map of the harbor. It detailed a proposed $200 million revitalization project. The city was planning to build a sweeping, elevated pedestrian promenade lined with boutique hospitality venues, connecting the old industrial piers directly to the downtown commercial sector. I traced the glowing red line of the proposed walkway as it snaked through the neighborhood. My breath hitched in my throat. The massive new corridor required a very specific right-of-way to connect the harbor to the main avenue. That required path cut directly through the alleyway and the footprint of the brick carriage house that sat firmly on my deed. My property was not just in the way. It was the absolute, non-negotiable linchpin of the entire municipal project. Without my land, the walkway could not be built. I looked across the table at the executives from Calder Stone. They were staring at me with a mixture of naked greed and outright panic. Julian looked like he was going to be physically ill. I leaned back in my leather chair, perfectly composed, as the true magnitude of the situation settled over me. They did not just want my house anymore, they desperately needed it to survive. The value of the shabby, ruined building my sister had thrown at my feet had just eclipsed everything she had stolen from me. The war had officially escalated, and for the first time, I was holding all the ammunition. 2 full years passed. 24 months of relentless grinding, sawdust clinging to my hair, and the constant rhythmic hum of the band saw completely transformed my reality. Docklight Atelier was no longer a desperate survival project pieced together by a grieving daughter in a ruined shell. It had matured into a highly respected, heavily sought-after boutique brand. We specialized in custom architectural woodwork and high-end furniture restoration specifically tailored for the city's rapidly emerging independent restaurant scene. The days of begging for small commissions and scraping by on microloans were entirely over. I now commanded a waitlist stretching 6 months into the future. With the main row house fully operational and generating consistent revenue, I turned my attention to the massive brick carriage house across the back alleyway. I did not just want to expand my production line to fulfill more orders. I wanted to build an entirely different kind of equity. Using the substantial profits from a massive restaurant fit-out, I gutted the carriage house and transformed it into a dedicated, state-of-the-art training facility. I opened an apprenticeship program specifically designed for young women who wanted to break into the male-dominated fields of carpentry, metal welding, and historic restoration. On any given Tuesday, the alleyway echoed with the sounds of 6 female apprentices firing up angle grinders, operating heavy planers, and welding steel frames. I walked among them, correcting their posture, adjusting their grips, and passing down the exact same vital lessons Emmett had taught me during my darkest days. It gave the atelier a profound, undeniable sense of purpose. We were not just selling beautiful furniture to wealthy clients. We were handing out leverage to women who had been told to stay out of the workshop. The property was no longer just a business. It was an engine of opportunity. Despite the rapid, sweeping growth, the old building still held its secrets. One humid Sunday afternoon, needing to run new ventilation ductwork for the ground floor spray booth, I climbed up into the cramped, sweltering attic space. Tucked away behind a rotting brick chimney breast, hidden beneath a thick layer of pink fiberglass insulation, I found an old, dented floral biscuit tin. Inside was a neatly tied bundle of envelopes, all written in my mother's familiar, precise handwriting. The paper was brittle, smelling faintly of lavender and old dust. They were not addressed to anyone in particular. They were private journal entries, unsent letters to herself and, perhaps, to me. I sat on the rough, dusty floorboards and read them by the weak light filtering through the attic vent. For years, I had believed my parents were completely aligned in their relentless pursuit of suburban, sterile wealth, but the ink on these pages painted a vastly different, agonizingly conflicted picture. My mother had fought bitterly behind closed doors with my father to keep the Docklight property out of the corporate liquidation block. She viewed the dusty workshop downstairs as the very last tether our family had to honest, physical labor and genuine creation. The most heartbreaking discovery was an unfinished letter dated just 3 weeks before the fatal car crash. My mother wrote explicitly about Sloan. She admitted a deep, agonizing fear that Sloan possessed a cold, ruthless streak that would eventually tear the family apart. Sloan only respects what she can spend immediately, my mother had written, her pen pressing hard into the paper. She will never understand the weight of an heirloom or the dignity of preserving something broken. The letter detailed my mother's quiet, desperate intention to meet with a new estate lawyer to amend the irrevocable trusts, bypass Sloan's authority, and legally protect my share of the inheritance. She simply ran out of time before she could execute the change. The grief that washed over me in that sweltering attic was heavy, but it was no longer paralyzing or sad. It was pure, highly combustible fuel. My mother had never wanted me to be left with nothing. That newfound fuel was severely tested exactly 1 week later. I was in the final stages of negotiating a massive, multi-year contract to furnish a new chain of independent boutique hotels along the eastern seaboard. It was a monumental deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, guaranteed to secure the atelier's financial future for the next decade. The morning I was scheduled to sign the final, binding paperwork, the heavy oak door of the atelier swung open. 2 stern-faced city inspectors marched through the entrance, their boots heavy on the reclaimed hardwood. They bypassed the beautifully curated showroom entirely, their eyes hard and dismissive, and demanded immediate access to the rear carriage house. They held a formal, multi-page complaint detailing alleged hazardous material violations, improper commercial zoning usage, and severe noise ordinance breaches. The lead inspector, a man who refused to even look me in the eye, informed me that a formal municipal hearing was being scheduled. Until the board reached a resolution, they were placing an immediate, mandatory suspension on my mixed-use operating permit. My entire production line, the lifeblood of my business, was legally frozen in a single instant. The apprentices were forced to power down their machines and go home. I immediately called Naomi. Within 48 hours, she had deployed her forensic accounting skills to trace the origins of the anonymous complaint. She followed a convoluted, heavily obscured paper trail through 3 different shell corporations registered in Delaware. The ultimate parent company financing the legal harassment was undeniable. It was Calder Stone Assemblies. Julian and his corporate backers had realized I was never going to sell the property willingly, so they were attempting to bleed my business dry by severing my legal ability to fulfill contracts. In the past, I might have panicked. I might have stormed into their corporate lobby or taken to social media to cry foul out of desperation. But I was no longer that frightened girl sitting on a damp sleeping bag. I drove to Naomi's office, poured a cup of black coffee, and drafted a completely different, infinitely colder battle plan. "We are not going to fight them on the zoning complaint," I declared, watching Naomi's eyes narrow with intrigue. "If we fight the complaint, we are playing defense on their terms. We are going to change the entire classification of the battlefield." I instructed Naomi to immediately file a massive, overwhelmingly comprehensive application to grant the entire Docklight property, including the newly renovated carriage house, absolute historic preservation status. We compiled the original Bellamy blueprints, the vintage photographs of the harbor from 1974, and the intricate details of the artisan craftsmanship embedded in the very walls of the building. We built an airtight legal narrative that proved the property was a vital, irreplaceable cornerstone of the city's early industrial heritage. Naomi smiled, her predatory instincts fully engaged. By applying for this highly specific, culturally protected status, we triggered an automatic, state-level injunction against any municipal attempts to alter the zoning, issue commercial fines, or condemn the property while the application was actively under review. The shell company's complaints were instantly frozen by a higher legal authority. We had effectively built a titanium fortress around the atelier overnight. 3 months later, the city's Heritage Commission formally convened. They reviewed the flawlessly restored mahogany staircase, the booming female apprenticeship program, and the undeniable historical footprint of my grandfather's forgotten work. They slammed a heavy wooden gavel down and granted the row house conditional historic preservation status. The malicious zoning complaints filed by Calder Stone Assemblies were instantly rendered null and void, dismissed as entirely irrelevant against a legally protected municipal landmark. As I walked out of the massive stone municipal building with the certified historic plaque resting heavy in my hands, a profound realization settled over the city's real estate vultures. The men in bespoke suits who had tried to crush me finally understood the brutal truth. I was completely untouchable. While the atelier's foundation grew impenetrable, the polished marble of my sister's world in Boston was quietly fracturing. Sloane had spent the last several years cultivating an image of effortless, elite success. She had launched a luxury lifestyle brand, curating high-end home goods for a wealthy demographic that only existed on social media. But the reality behind her carefully filtered posts was a hemorrhaging balance sheet. Her inventory was sitting stagnant in expensive, climate-controlled warehouses. She had racked up over $90,000 in high-interest credit card debt just to maintain the illusion of profitability. Worse still, the adjustable rate on her sweeping $3 million penthouse had recently reset, pushing her monthly mortgage payments into an unsustainable stratosphere. Sloane was suffocating beneath the weight of the capital she had stolen from our parents' estate, discovering too late that liquid cash burns rapidly when there is no actual substance to sustain it. It was during one of her desperate, late-night financial audits that she stumbled across the truth. A prominent East Coast business journal had recently published an extensive feature on the explosive revitalization of the Ashby Harbor waterfront. The article highlighted the massive municipal investment and the skyrocketing property values. Right in the center of the 2-page spread was a high-resolution photograph of the Docklight Atelier. The caption clearly named me, Aaliyah Newman, as the visionary owner and sole proprietor of the historically protected artisan compound. Sloane stared at the screen, calculating the square footage, the commercial zoning, and the newly appraised value of the district. The math was brutal. She finally understood that the rotting, condemned brick shell she had gleefully tossed at my feet was now worth exponentially more than the dwindling portfolio she had hoarded for herself. The garbage she had discarded had turned into an empire. 2 days later, my phone vibrated on the workbench. It was a text message from a number I had not saved, but I knew the cadence instantly. It was dripping with a sugary manufactured warmth that made my stomach turn. Aaliyah, sweetie, I am going to be in town this week for a quick networking event. It has been entirely too long. I miss you so much. Let us grab lunch and catch up properly. I would love to see your little workshop. She spoke as if the brutal, calculated theft in our parents' dining room had simply been a minor misunderstanding. There was no apology, no hesitation, just the arrogant assumption that I was still the vulnerable, desperate girl she had left behind. I did not ignore the message. I replied with a single, highly controlled sentence. I have a tight schedule, but I can meet you for exactly 45 minutes at Tessa's Roastery on the corner of 5th and Main at noon on Thursday. I deliberately chose not to invite her to the atelier. By setting the meeting at the local coffee shop, I was establishing an absolute boundary. She was not allowed to cross the threshold of my property. She was not permitted to step foot inside the sanctuary I had built. When Thursday arrived, I walked the 2 blocks to the roastery. Tessa had reserved a quiet corner booth for me. I sat at the very wooden counter I had milled and joined with my own hands, tracing the smooth, oiled grain of the oak as I waited. Sloane walked through the glass doors exactly 5 minutes late, an old power play designed to make the other person wait. She was draped in designer cashmere, carrying a handbag that cost more than my first industrial table saw. But my eyes were trained to spot stress fractures in wood, and I could easily spot them in her. The tension around her jaw was tight. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. She looked like a woman who was running out of time. "Aaliyah, you look incredibly well," Sloane cooed. Sliding into the booth opposite me, she reached across the table, attempting to grasp my hand. I calmly picked up my ceramic coffee mug, forcing her hand to retreat empty. "Hello, Sloane. What brings you down from Boston?" She waved her hand dismissively, ordering a complicated espresso drink from the waitress before leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, just some tedious investor meetings. But I really wanted to check on you. I read the most fascinating article about your neighborhood. Who would have thought this dreadful little area would actually turn around? You must be so relieved that the property did not completely collapse on you." "It is fully stabilized," I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I have a good team." Sloane stirred her coffee slowly, her eyes darting around the cafe. "I saw pictures of the building. It looks quite different. Did you manage to get that old shed in the back cleared out? That alleyway must be a nightmare for your insurance premiums. I imagine a structure that large without proper commercial rights is just a massive tax burden." There it was. She could not even maintain the facade of sisterly concern for 10 minutes. She was not here to apologize. She was here on a reconnaissance mission. "The carriage house is fully permitted," I stated plainly, watching her reaction. "It holds my apprenticeship program. The city granted the entire parcel a mixed-use commercial and educational designation." Sloane's impeccably manicured fingers twitched against her saucer. A flash of pure, unadulterated greed crossed her face before she quickly masked it with a bright, artificial smile. "Educational. That is so sweet. Aaliyah, very charitable of you. But really, running a school out of a backyard. Have you not considered cashing out? I have connections with several major developers who are aggressively acquiring footprints in this specific zip code. I could easily introduce you. We could package the property and get you a massive payout. You could finally buy a real house in a decent suburb." She was trying to position herself as my broker, trying to slide her hands back into my pockets. What she did not know was that I had spent the previous evening sitting in Naomi's office, reviewing the final, devastating piece of our forensic investigation. Naomi had successfully subpoenaed the banking records of the shell corporation that had filed the anonymous zoning complaints against me. The money used to pay the corporate lawyers had flowed from a holding company based in Delaware. But Naomi did not stop there. She traced the initial capitalization of that holding company back 4 years. The exact sum of $140,000 had been deposited into that account just weeks after my parents' funeral. It was the exact amount of the missing maintenance fund that was supposed to keep my roof from caving in. Sloane was not just a greedy sister. She was a criminal who had actively laundered trust funds to starve me out. And now she was sitting across from me, pretending to be my savior. I looked at her, holding the absolute power of that knowledge silently in my chest. If I laid the bank records on the table right now, she would panic and retreat behind her expensive lawyers. I needed her to step fully into the trap. I needed her to commit. "I am not interested in selling to a developer. Sloane," I said softly, letting a hint of fake vulnerability slip into my voice. "Running the business is exhausting. But I do not know how to navigate a commercial buyout on my own." Sloane's eyes lit up with predatory triumph. She thought she had found the crack in my armor. She believed I was still intimidated by the corporate world, still desperate for her sophisticated guidance. "You do not have to do it alone," Sloane murmured, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I am your family. We should be working together on this. Let me make a few calls. I will handle the heavy lifting." "I will think about it," I said, standing up from the booth and leaving a $5 bill on the table for my coffee. "My 45 minutes are up. I have to get back to the floor." "Of course, sweetie," Sloane beamed, looking more relaxed than she had since she walked in. "We will be in touch very soon." I walked out of the roastery and stepped into the crisp harbor air. I did not look back. I had given her exactly what she wanted, the illusion of control. I let her walk away, believing she could still manipulate me with the ghost of our family ties. But as I walked back toward the fortified brick walls of the atelier, I knew the truth. Sloane was going to return for the property, and when she did, she was not going to come alone. She was going to bring the developers with her, walking blindly into a slaughter she could not possibly foresee. As the calendar turned toward the 5-year mark of my arrival in the district, the speculative whispers finally materialized into concrete municipal action. The mayor held a press conference to officially announce a massive, fully funded package for the waterfront promenade and a sweeping boutique hospitality corridor. Overnight, the Docklight District transformed from a promising revitalization zone into the most fiercely contested real estate market on the eastern seaboard. Property values did not just climb, they violently erupted. At the absolute epicenter of this explosion sat my row house and the carriage house. Naomi called me into her office early one morning, her desk covered in freshly printed corporate filings. She had been tracking the aggressive acquisitions happening on the blocks surrounding the atelier. The buyers were a private equity syndicate planning a massive, multi-tiered complex featuring a luxury hotel, high-end retail spaces, and a sweeping event venue. They have successfully acquired 90% of the block, Naomi explained, tapping a pencil against a sprawling architectural rendering she had sourced from a city planner. But their entire design hinges on creating a seamless pedestrian flow from the main avenue directly to the new harbor walkway. Your property is the geographic anchor. Without your exact corner lot, their proposed event space hits a literal brick wall. If they have to redesign the footprint around you, their primary commercial lenders will pull the financing. And their entire 9-figure loan application is currently bleeding out, waiting on your deed. Naomi slid a photograph across the glass desk. It showed a tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair standing next to a very familiar woman at a Boston charity gala. The lead developer of the syndicate is a man named Grant Mercer, Naomi stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. And according to the society pages, Grant Mercer just proposed to Sloane Newman 3 months ago. I stared at the photograph. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The sudden, overly sweet text messages, the staged, accidental meeting at Tessa's roastery, the desperate probing about my commercial rights. It had never been about sisterly guilt or family reconciliation. It was a highly coordinated, desperate business campaign. Sloane was not just trying to steal my success. She was trying to save her fiancé's sinking mega project. She was leveraging our dead parents' memory to secure a real estate acquisition. Once they realized I was not going to blindly hand over the property through casual manipulation, they aggressively escalated their tactics. The psychological warfare began the very next week. My workshop was suddenly bombarded with deliveries. Massive, expensive bouquets of white lilies began arriving at the atelier's front door. They were the exact same flowers we had laid on our parents' caskets. It was a sickening, calculated touch. Woven between the stems were handwritten cards on heavy, embossed stationery. They contained glossy photographs of us as children, playing in our old suburban backyard. The messages were entirely engineered to inflict maximum emotional damage. I know we have had our differences, but Mother would be absolutely heartbroken to see us fighting like this. One card read. Another said, "Family is the only thing that truly matters in the end. Let us fix this together." I threw the lilies directly into the industrial dumpster out back. I fed the childhood photographs and the guilt-laden cards straight into the wood chipper. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard clarity. When the emotional manipulation failed to produce a signature on a bill of sale, they deployed their final desperate weapon. A thick envelope arrived via certified courier. Inside was a legal document titled as a family settlement memorandum. It was supposedly dated 3 weeks after the funeral. The text aggressively asserted that the transfer of the Docklight property into my name was merely a temporary custodianship designed to shield the asset during the probate process. It claimed that any future appreciation in the property's value was legally required to be split evenly between the two sisters. At the bottom of the page was a signature that looked remarkably like my own. right next to Sloane's. They were trying to claim that half of my empire already belonged to them. I brought the documents straight to Naomi. She did not panic. She did not even blink. She simply smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression, and immediately contacted a highly specialized digital forensics expert who contracted for the federal courts. It took the expert exactly 48 hours to utterly dismantle the memorandum. "It is a remarkably sloppy forgery," Naomi reported to me over the phone, the satisfaction radiating through the receiver. The expert found distinct pixelation mismatches under microscopic review. "Your supposed signature was digitally lifted from an old college loan application our parents co-signed a decade ago and grafted onto this new document. The metadata embedded in the printed barcode proves the page was generated just 2 weeks ago, not 5 years ago. It is a fabricated piece of intimidation." They thought I would instantly crumble at the sight of a legal threat. They expected me to hire a cheap lawyer, panic over the potential court costs, and ultimately settle out of court by selling them the land. I decided right then that I was entirely done playing defense. I was done ignoring their calls and dodging their corporate proxies. It was time to pull them out of the shadows and force them to step onto my territory. The 5-year anniversary of the day I first turned the rusted iron water valve in the dark was approaching. To mark the milestone, I had organized a massive evening gala to officially launch the Docklight Community Trust, a new operational structure for the property. The guest list was a fortress of local power. It included the city's top historic preservation officials, influential architectural journalists, my wealthiest independent clients, and several prominent municipal judges who had bought custom furniture from me. I took a thick and gold-leafed invitation card from the stack on my workbench. I handwrote Sloane and Grant's names across the front in sweeping calligraphy. I mailed it directly to Sloane's Boston penthouse via overnight priority shipping. I wanted them there. I wanted them to walk into the absolute center of the world they had tried to destroy. On the night of the gala, the harbor wind was sharp and cold, but the atelier burned like a beacon against the dark sky. The exterior brick was illuminated by sweeping architectural spotlights. The massive steel-framed windows glowed with warm, golden light, projecting the silhouettes of 100 formally dressed guests holding champagne flutes. A red carpet led from the cracked asphalt directly up to my polished mahogany doors. Press photographers clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing rapidly as the city's elite arrived. I stood just inside the main hall, wearing a sharply tailored emerald suit, watching the street through the glass. Right on time, a massive, luxurious black town car turned the corner and slowly glided to a halt in front of the atelier. The driver stepped out and pulled the rear door open. Sloane stepped onto the pavement, wearing a shimmering silver gown. Clutching Grant Mercer's arm, she froze. I watched her eyes sweep over the flashing cameras, the velvet ropes, and the sheer, undeniable opulence radiating from the building. This was the exact spot where she had once pictured me crying over rotting wood and unpaid utility bills. Now, it was a fortress of wealth and influence, packed with people who would never answer to her. The trap had been set perfectly in the open, and she had just walked right through the front door. The interior of Docklight House was entirely unrecognizable from the damp, decaying tomb I had inherited. Warm, amber light spilled from custom-forged iron chandeliers, casting a rich golden hue over the meticulously restored exposed brick walls. The expansive ground floor had been temporarily transformed into a living museum of my grandfather's legacy. The original Bellamy blueprints, painstakingly preserved and mounted behind museum-grade glass, hung along the main corridor like priceless works of art. Waiters in crisp black vests navigated the sophisticated crowd, carrying silver trays adorned with crystal flutes of champagne. The air smelled of expensive perfume, polished mahogany, and the faint, sweet memory of fresh cedar. The guests, a highly curated collection of the city's elite, moved seamlessly between the historic weight of the architecture and the undeniable modern luxury of the atelier. Sloane's arrival was a masterclass in theatrical performance. She glided through the heavy double doors with Grant Mercer anchored to her side. playing the role of the immensely proud, supportive older sister for the local press photographers gathered by the entrance. She wore a shimmering silver gown and a smile of absolute perfection. But the moment the camera flashes faded, her true focus was revealed. Her eyes did not seek me out. Instead, they immediately locked onto the heavy bronze plaque mounted near the coat check, which proudly declared the building a protected municipal landmark. She scrutinized the elegant architectural models of the carriage house expansion displayed on a central pedestal. She was mentally cataloging the wealth, measuring the square footage, and silently calculating the exact value of the empire she had thrown away. It did not take long for Grant Mercer to detach himself from Sloane and navigate through the sea of guests toward me. I was standing near the grand staircase, casually observing the room. Grant possessed the aggressively polished demeanor of a man accustomed to buying his way out of any minor inconvenience. He stopped next to me, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, and leaned in with a conspiratorial, practiced ease. "It is an incredibly impressive operation you have built here, Aaliyah," Grant said, his voice a smooth, calculated purr. "Sloane told me you had a talent for fixing things, but this is truly remarkable. However, managing a historic property is a brutal, exhausting marathon. My syndicate is prepared to offer you an exit strategy tonight. We are willing to write a check for $3,250,000. It is a highly generous, seven-figure valuation. You can walk away completely free, without the burden of the upcoming legal disputes regarding your sister's rightful share of the estate." He paused, letting the thinly veiled threat hang in the air between us. "It would be an absolute tragedy to see a beautiful night like this overshadowed by an ugly, protracted litigation process," Grant continued softly. "Families should not fight in court. Let us handle this quietly." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I simply smiled at him, a gesture completely devoid of warmth or intimidation. "Enjoy the champagne, Grant," I replied smoothly, my voice perfectly steady. "The catering is exceptional this evening." My absolute refusal to engage or show even a fraction of panic caused a visible tremor in his arrogant facade. His jaw tightened as I turned my back on him and walked gracefully toward the back of the showroom. My composure was the one thing they had not modeled in their aggressive financial projections. They expected a desperate artist. They were dealing with a heavily fortified adversary. I found Emmett and Inez standing near the newly restored apothecary cabinets. Emmett was holding a small, flat object wrapped in a piece of protective felt. He handed it to me with a quiet, solemn nod. "I spent the last 2 days carefully extracting this from the false bottom of the lockbox you gave me," Emmett muttered, keeping his voice low amidst the chatter of the gala. The moisture had warped the wood tight, but I finally got it loose without tearing the pages. I unwrapped the felt. It was a small, worn leather notebook. It was my mother's daily ledger. I carefully opened the fragile pages to a dog-eared section dated nearly a decade ago. It detailed a vicious argument between my mother and Sloane regarding the future of the artisan workshop. My eyes scanned the faded ink until I found a direct quote, underlined twice by my mother's pen. Sloane had screamed at her, calling the row house a useless pile of bricks, not even worth the effort to sell. I closed the notebook, gripping the worn leather tightly in my palm. The sheer audacity of my sister attempting to claim a moral or legal right to this building was now entirely dismantled by her own historical arrogance. At that exact moment, Naomi materialized beside me. She looked immaculate in a sharp black suit, but it was the predatory gleam in her eyes that commanded attention. She leaned close to my ear. "The federal forensics expert just transmitted the final, certified affidavit to my secure server," Naomi whispered, her tone laced with absolute triumph. "The family settlement memorandum is definitively classified as a fraudulent, spliced forgery. We have the binding legal documentation ready to file. If they try to pull the trigger tonight, we have enough ammunition to publicly execute their entire corporate reputation." I nodded, slipping my mother's notebook into the pocket of my blazer. The board was completely set. It was time to force the final move. I walked toward the center of the room and gently tapped my heavy silver ring against the side of a crystal glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. I projected my voice effortlessly across the expansive room, thanking the municipal leaders, the preservation board, and my loyal clients for their unwavering support over the last 5 years. In exactly 30 minutes, I will be making a special announcement regarding the permanent future structure of the Docklight Atelier, I declared, letting my gaze drift momentarily toward the back of the room. I caught Sloane's eye. A distinctly triumphant smirk twisted her perfectly painted lips. In her twisted, arrogant mind, she had already won. She assumed my calm demeanor, and this sudden announcement meant I was finally capitulating, that I was preparing to publicly announce a lucrative buyout or a joint partnership to save face. She thought the pressure had finally broken me. As the crowd dispersed back into quiet conversations, Sloane immediately detached herself from the group of investors and intercepted me at the base of the grand mahogany staircase. "Aaliyah, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial affection. "That was a lovely toast, but before you make any grand announcements to the press, let us talk privately, just the two of us. We need to finalize the details of the transition." I gestured gracefully up the stairs. We ascended the polished wooden steps in silence, leaving the noise of the gala behind. I led her to the second floor, pushing open the heavy double doors to my private quarters. This space had once been a horrifying, dust-choked nightmare of rotting floorboards and sagging ceilings. Now, it was a breathtaking sanctuary of wealth and refined taste. Massive exposed beams framed vaulted ceilings. Custom velvet furnishings sat upon imported silk rugs, and floor-to-ceiling glass doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the glittering harbor. Sloane stepped over the threshold, and for the first time all evening, the mask completely slipped from her face. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her eyes wide as she visually consumed the sheer, undeniable luxury of the space. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. The naked, ravenous greed she had tried so desperately to hide was now entirely exposed, radiating from her as she stared at the absolute masterpiece she had blindly thrown away. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us inside my private sanctuary. The moment the latch caught, the warm, sisterly facade melted off Sloane's face like hot wax. She turned to me, her eyes sweeping over the custom velvet and vaulted ceilings, calculating the exact dollar amount of my life. "We are done playing games, Aaliyah," Sloane snapped, her voice stripped of any artificial sweetness. "You have had your fun playing carpenter, but this property is sitting on a commercial gold mine. You are going to sign over a 51% controlling stake to Grant's holding company tonight. In exchange, we will generously handle the neighborhood zoning board, and I will personally ensure our family matters are settled quietly without ruining your little boutique brand." Grant stepped forward, loosening his silk tie. The polished gentleman from downstairs was gone, replaced by a ruthless corporate enforcer. "If you refuse to cooperate, Aaliyah, my syndicate will drag you into a public legal war. We will tie this building up in probate litigation for a decade. We have the capital to starve you out. You will lose the workshop, your apprentices, and everything you built. Sign the partnership agreement." I let their threats echo in the pristine acoustics of the room. They had absolutely no idea that the discreet, red blinking light on the smoke detector above us was a high-definition audio and video recording system installed directly into the reinforced ceiling just 2 weeks prior. Their extortion was being perfectly documented in real time. "Let us go downstairs," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It is time for my announcement," Sloane smirked, adjusting her diamond necklace. She thought she had broken me. She thought the threat of a 10-year lawsuit had forced my hand. I led them back down the grand staircase. The low hum of the gala faded as I stepped up to the small wooden podium positioned in the center of the exhibition hall. The city's elite turned their attention to me. Flashes from the local press illuminated the room. Sloane and Grant positioned themselves right in the front row, wearing the smug expressions of conquerors waiting for their tribute. "Thank you all for being here," I began, looking out over the sea of faces. 5 years ago, I was handed a decaying shell of a building. Tonight, we celebrate its total resurrection. But a building with this much history does not belong to just one person. It belongs to the community it serves. That is why I am standing before you tonight, not to announce a sale, but to announce the immediate, irrevocable establishment of the Docklight Community Trust. The smug smile vanished from Sloane's face instantly. Grant stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "I have legally transferred the total ownership of this entire property, including the carriage house and the adjacent alleyway, into a highly fortified conservation trust," I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady. "This structure permanently locks the real estate into a strict preservation, educational, and artisan business mandate. It can never be demolished, it can never be subdivided, and it can never be sold to a commercial developer." A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. The architectural journalists began taking furious notes. Naomi Voss stepped up to the podium, taking the microphone from my hand. She looked like an executioner in a tailored suit. "As the lead legal counsel for the Docklight Community Trust, I can confirm that the paperwork was fully ratified by a federal judge this morning," Naomi announced. "Coupled with the historic preservation status and a newly approved municipal easement, the current title is completely impenetrable. Any outside claims to this land are officially null and void." Grant took a step backward, the blood completely draining from his face. His entire 9-figure real estate mega project, the boutique hotel, the retail corridor, it was all built on the assumption that he could eventually force me out. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His loan application was dead. His syndicate was going to crucify him. But Naomi was not finished. She looked directly at Sloane, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "Furthermore," Naomi said, the room falling into a deathly silence, "we received the final report from a federal document examiner this evening. The so-called family settlement memorandum that was recently presented to my client has been definitively proven to be a fraudulent document, forged using digitally spliced signatures. Presenting it as a genuine claim of ownership constitutes felony fraud." The journalists in the room gasped. Camera shutters began firing in rapid succession, the blinding lights flashing wildly against Sloane's pale, panicked face. "And finally," Naomi declared, raising her voice to be heard over the clicking cameras, "at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, we filed a massive civil lawsuit against a specific Delaware holding company. The suit details the deliberate embezzlement of $140,000 in maintenance funds and insurance payouts at the time of the original inheritance division. Our forensic accountants have successfully traced the entire chain of transactions straight into a corporate shell entity controlled entirely by Sloane Newman." The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. Every single person in the room, the judges, the investors, the wealthy clients, was staring at my sister. The glittering, untouchable world she had built for herself in Boston was disintegrating right in front of her eyes, broadcast live to the city's highest social circles. Sloane lost her mind. The perfectly cultivated mask of elite sophistication shattered completely. She lunged forward, her face twisted in an ugly primal rage, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You planned this," Sloane screamed, her voice cracking hysterically over the crowd. "You set me up. This place is nothing. It is a pathetic, rotting pile of garbage. I told you 5 years ago it was a useless pile of bricks." I threw it away because it was worthless. The room was paralyzed by her outburst. I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward her until I was standing less than 2 feet away. I looked into her frantic, terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply delivered the execution. "Take this shabby house." "I do not need it anyway," I said, repeating her exact words, articulating every single syllable with deadly precision. Sloane froze, her breath catching in her throat as the memory of that day in the dining room slammed into her. You said it, I told her, my tone as calm and cold as a winter ocean. I was just the one crazy enough to turn your contempt into my empire. I nodded slightly to the two large security guards standing near the entrance. They stepped forward immediately, flanking Sloane and Grant. Grant did not even try to argue. He looked utterly destroyed, his career evaporating into thin air. He turned and walked toward the exit, abandoning his fiancée to the wolves. Sloane tried to speak, but no words came out. The security guards gently but firmly directed her toward the heavy mahogany doors. She was escorted out into the freezing harbor night, surrounded by the blinding flashes of the press cameras and the heavy condemning silence of the entire room. Her fraudulent commercial deal collapsed instantly, right there on the pavement. I turned away from the glass doors and walked out onto the front steps of the atelier, to breathe in the crisp air. I looked up at the glowing brick and the towering industrial windows. 5 years ago, I had been shoved into the dark, handed a pile of debt and ruin by a family that wanted to see me drown. Now, I stood on the threshold of a historic monument that I had carved out of the decay with my own 2 hands. I was no longer a victim surviving the wreckage of my past. I was the architect who had finally forced that past to bow down. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.